It's a great pleasure to be here. I have addressed a number of different events of schools of political studies. It's a new life for me. It's not a career, but it's a very interesting hobby. Uh, and because I meet great people from all over Europe. I was asked to talk about the crisis in human rights, about what I have seen and learned over the last few years working as Commissioner for Human Rights, and to give a diagnosis and then to try to understand how serious the disease is, whether it is curable or not. My perspective is very Eurocentric. I've done almost all of my work in broader Europe. I'm doing some work right now for the United Nations. The United Nations has its own huge problems, and we can talk about those if you like. But I just wanted to flag that the crisis in human rights is much broader than a European crisis. And you only have to mention people like Trump, Duterte, Bolsonaro, etc. This is a much wider phenomenon, a much wider problem, but I want to focus on the European aspects of it. It's based on my 6 years as Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, during which I went to all 47 member states of the Council of Europe at least once. I went to 40 of them at least twice, but my most common destinations were Ukraine, where I went 7 times, including in Crimea and in Donetsk several times, and Turkey, where I went 5 times. I would have loved to come to Russia more often. After I wrote my report on Crimea, I was persona non grata in Russia, and they refused to cooperate with me after 2014. So my Russian has gotten a little bit rusty. But I would submit to you that what we are seeing is a multi-level crisis affecting human rights, that it is a crisis in which we have populist challenges to the very principles underlying the system, and a lot of human rights risks flow from that. We have European level crises, we have national human rights crises, and we have a crisis in the organizations which are meant to uphold these standards and which embed the standards. And I want to go through all of these challenges that we are facing and then hear your views on it. Now, in my view, the principles underlying the European human rights system, there are several of them which I think are quite important. One is individualism. Rights belong to individuals. If you look at the inter-American system or the African system, in the inter-American system, the environment has certain rights. Not so much in Europe. In the African system, you have the Charter of Rights of peoples and individuals. But in Europe, it's very much an individualistic system. That has its pluses, its minuses, but that's the way it is. Universalism and non-discrimination. In other words, all rights belong to all people within a certain jurisdiction. The system is evolving. It is not set in stone. This is why judges in the European Court of Human Rights call the European Convention on Human Rights a living instrument. What was a standard 50 years ago is no longer the standard now. 50 years ago, the status of women was very different. You could hit your children. You could do many things that were acceptable. No longer are many of those things acceptable. So our understanding of human rights changes over time. And finally, sovereignty is limited. States permit others to scrutinize their human rights. This is a legitimate activity of states to look at what they're doing within their countries in the realm of human rights, because all of them have signed up to the same standards, the European Convention on Human Rights and other standards. Now, when you listen to populists, mostly I'm talking about national populists, not so much left populists, because left populists don't like Europe, they don't like austerity, they don't like inequality, but they tend not to challenge the principles underlying the human rights system. So I'm talking about right populists here, primarily. What do they say? They say the wrong individuals have been given rights, that the silent majority has no stake in the system. Who are the wrong individuals in their view? It's migrants, minorities, persons with deviant lifestyles, terrorists, and they claim that these people have been given priority over people like you and me. And that's wrong. And that this equality that exists in European human rights norms, it is exaggerated. It has been taken to the extreme. It's been taken so far that it harms family, tradition, our culture. They say that change has taken place, but it has gone far beyond what the founding fathers of the system envisioned. Not only that, but especially if you look at what many of them say, they say, our country, we no longer rule ourselves. Our country is being ruled from abroad by overpaid civil servants and unelected judges. They often forget that the judges of the European Court of Human Rights are actually elected by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, but that's a detail. They say these judges are unelected and the civil servants decide everything. Well, this creates a lot of risks for human rights across the board, and I want to go through some of them because we've seen the challenges from populists affect the observance of a number of different human rights. First, the right to seek asylum. We've seen countries in Europe doing just about anything to deny people the opportunity to ask for asylum. So you have pushbacks at borders, both at land borders and at sea borders, the creation of vigilante groups to hunt people down, the construction of a whole network of fences over the last few years, including in Latvia, by the way, on the eastern border, fast-track procedures so that basically anything that needs to be done to prevent people from seeking and gaining asylum is being done. The second right at risk from national populists is a right to equality and non-discrimination. All Muslims are being portrayed as terrorists, as being the enemies of women's rights, as being incapable of integration. So in other words, the narrative is such that it's legitimate to discriminate against Muslims or people portrayed to be as Muslims. Media freedom. One of the first targets of national populists is public service broadcasters, but not only public service broadcasters, but also commercial media. Why? Because they're claimed to be unpatriotic, unrepresentative, and we see this not only in countries that have taken over their public service broadcasters, but if you've been following the very interesting political scandal that brought down the recent government in Austria, we heard what's his name, the head of the Freedom Party in Austria say, we need a media environment like the one in Hungary, because then we will be able to achieve our goals. So they want to put some order into the media environment so it's more friendly to their goals. Gender equality and women's rights. National populists in particular don't like women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. They want to limit access to abortion, to contraception, to sexuality education. They resist action against domestic violence. They really don't like the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe. And some, for example, Mr. Trump has led an effort to try to remove the word gender from international human rights documents, because gender, in their conception, is a very dangerous concept which could lead to chaos, undermine the family, tradition, and you name it. LGBTI rights, pitting children's rights against LGBTI rights. This is a Russian specialty to try to show that, no, we're not against LGBT rights, but we're for children. Preempting the possibility of same-sex marriage or partnerships, usually by changing constitutions, but not only, but also justifying hate crimes against LGBTI persons. At the same time, we have a number of, at least during my mandate from 2012 to 2018, we had a number of European-level human rights crises that affected a whole series of rights and the consequences of which we will face for many years to come. The first was the economic crisis, which affected many, many different countries. Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Croatia, Ireland, Latvia, Estonia, Cyprus, and more and more and more. And what I discovered was that the economic crisis eroded a number of different rights, not only social and economic rights, but especially equality. the crisis did not hit all of society the same way. It hit certain groups disproportionately. So who was hardest hit? Children, young people, older persons, but especially persons with disabilities. And this is in almost every country I visited. But it also affected access to justice, because many governments, to try to make their judiciaries pay for themselves, raised legal fees, court fees, cut legal aid budgets, so that at a time when people needed access to justice more than ever, access to justice declined. At the same time, in order to save money, what do you do in prisons and psychiatric institutions? You cut staff. And what does that do? That means that prisoners spend more and more time behind bars. They have no activities. People in psychiatric institutions need, since you don't have enough staff to work with the people in the psychiatric institutions, what do? You sedate the patients or you tie them down. So we saw a deterioration of conditions of detention and conditions in psychiatric institutions in many countries in Europe. The second Europe-level human rights crisis is Ukraine. More than 13,000 people dead in the middle of Europe. More than 1 million displaced. The contact line is a humanitarian disaster zone where an ecological catastrophe threatens because there's no access to clean water in many places. Civilians are targeted, restrictions on free movement. Crimea, of course, the Tatars are on the front line there. They are not only a foreign agent, their governing body is an extremist organization, which means that the entire civic leadership of the Tatars are considered to be extremist. Property rights, of course, I'm expecting in the next 10 years thousands and thousands of property rights cases to be brought before the European Court of Human Rights. I met the so-called foreign minister of the Donetsk People's Republic at one point, and the reason he wanted to meet with me is he was trying to figure out how they could screw Ukraine in the European Court of Human Rights by bringing cases against Ukraine about violations in the East. So we will see many, many cases which will be very difficult to adjudicate in the European Court of Human Rights. And of course, this has led to a whole new stage of East-West tensions and sanctions and hybrid war, which has a lot of fallout in the human rights field as well. Migration. And this is an ongoing crisis. This is not a new crisis, but it really got much more serious in 2015 and 2016. It existed before, but the system is still broken. You have inadequate search and rescue in the Mediterranean, such that many thousands of people die every year in the Mediterranean on the doorstep of the richest continent in the world. You have everybody treating the Mediterranean Sea as if it were an Italian sea. So everybody wants to help Italy save people, but then they all have to disembark in Italy. And it's not surprising that Italy is not happy with its situation. Very limited relocation from frontline countries, especially from Greece and Italy. The big plan didn't really work if you look at how many people actually were relocated. The new trend now is less pushbacks as paying people to do pullbacks. So in other words, you don't take people and tow their boat back to Libya or so on. You pay Turkey, Libya, and Morocco to pull back migrants. That way, you're not guilty of human rights violations. This is the new, the latest trend, I think, in the externalization of European border controls. We see that free movement within the EU is under threat. You have fences now between EU countries, so-called temporary border checks, which didn't used to exist, throwing the whole Schengen zone under doubt. Will this survive? And finally, you have efforts to make one's country less attractive. On the mistaken idea that people won't come if you make life really difficult for them. If you don't let them reunify with their families, if you cut their benefits, if you don't give them any training, if you make their status very unstable, then they won't come. That, I think, totally misreads the drivers of migration in Europe, and it makes countries not only less attractive for migrants, it makes countries less attractive in general. And Denmark is a leading country doing this. Fourth, European-level human rights crisis. We saw this basically, again, terrorism is nothing new on the European continent. Russia knows this, Northern Ireland knows this, Spain knows this. But in 2015, we saw a whole spate of terrorist attacks, and it coincided with a migration crisis, and it led to this rise of anti-Muslim sentiment, I think, to a level that we've not seen before. The use of ethnic and religious profiling by police and border guards had been declining. It was challenged in courts across Europe. But after the terrorist attacks, we saw a huge spike in complaints of ethnic and religious profiling in France, in Spain, in the UK, elsewhere. One of the first things that many countries did after these terrorist attacks is to very quickly adopt bad surveillance laws, giving the security services very often almost unlimited powers to snoop on their populations, regardless of whether people were under suspicion of having committed or planning a criminal act. And you had many, many bad, vague surveillance laws which are subject to abuse adopted in a very short period of time, accompanied very often by new restrictions on freedom of expression. In other words, if you are considered to be glorifying terrorist attacks or justifying terrorist attacks, you could face criminal sanctions in many European countries. And this is a relatively new trend. At the same time, we had a number of national human rights level crises. I often mention 5 countries where I saw a serious deterioration of the human rights situation during my mandate from 2012 to 2018. Now you could probably, I think you can add a couple of more countries since then, but the 5 cases that I mentioned are the following. First is Russia. One of the first things I had to engage with was the foreign agent law and the various other pieces of legislation trying to restrict arbitrarily the legitimate activities of non-governmental organizations in Russia. My first visit to Russia in 2012 as commissioner, you had massive inspections taking place across Russia among NGOs, so that NGOs were spending all of their time kind of providing documents that the authorities already had, and dealing a lot with this. And then we followed the domestic case law within Russia. We said this law is vague, it's bound to be arbitrarily interpreted. We did an analysis of domestic jurisprudence within Russia, and that's exactly what we found. Different courts were interpreting the law in very different ways. Freedom of assembly has been progressively restricted. It started before my mandate, but accelerated afterwards, such that now you basically have to, rather than just inform the authorities, you actually have to get their permission. Otherwise, they might knock your head in or detain you for quite a long period of time. Internet freedom, increasingly restricted. Homophobia. I would say homophobia has become almost state policy in Russia. The law banning propaganda against homosexuality, I think, has led to huge problems and has actually encouraged people to engage in hate crime attacks against lesbians and gays and others. A very dangerous law adopted in 2014, basically allowing the Constitutional Court to rule whether it's possible to implement European Court of Human Rights judgments. Now, imagine if every country in the Council of Europe allowed their courts to say, it's not possible to implement this judgment. Then the whole system collapses. So for me, a key indicator of the Russian government's intentions, how often the Minister of Justice refers cases to your constitutional court to see whether or not it's possible to implement them. He did it on the Yukos case, not surprising, on prisoners' voting rights, but other than that, fortunately, it hasn't gone too far. North Caucasus, I call it a human rights free zone, not the whole of North Caucasus, but Chechnya in particular. The recent attacks and campaign against gays, but also journalists, human rights activists, very tough place to do human rights work or to be from sexual minorities. Human rights crisis number 2, Azerbaijan. Again, freedom of association, assembly, expression, increasingly restricted. Sometimes they follow Russia's lead. Other times they invent new ways to screw the opposition and to restrict civil society. HRDs are human rights defenders. While Azerbaijan had the rotating presidency of the Council of Europe, they put all of their major human rights defenders in prison. It was quite brazen. So one week I have all the defenders in my office in Strasbourg. The next week I'm visiting them in prison in Azerbaijan. It was quite striking. Most of them have, some of them are still in prison. Some are in exile. Many have stopped doing human rights work altogether. You've had a number of cases. What's interesting, in the European Court of Human Rights, there is something called an Article 18 violation. Article 18 basically says, of the European Convention, it says this restriction is not legitimate. It's an abuse of rights. And if a state is found to be in violation of Article 18, in other words, some kind of a restriction has taken place and it's illegitimate, the court will find an Article 18 violation. Very, very rare in the case law of the court. What it basically means is a court says you put this person in prison to silence them and not for a legitimate reason. So you have a number of different cases of Article 18 violations, which is quite unique in the Council of Europe context, and a failure to implement judgments. I don't know, I saw that Ilgar Mammadov was on the program here. I don't know if he's here, but that was his case in particular. You had a judgment saying, release Mr. Mammadov, and for several years the authorities didn't release him. But that was not the only case. Number 3, Turkey. Turkey is a big human rights disaster zone now. In the southeast, you had a huge human rights crisis taking place, which was largely hidden from the world when the conflict between the state and Kurdish terrorists, kind of the PKK and others, resumed in 2015, where you had the authorities basically bombing villages to save them from terrorists. And the scale of destruction was massive. The UN did a good report using satellite imagery of the destruction, where you basically had heavy weaponry and bombardments in urban areas in southeast Turkey. And almost nobody from the outside got to see this because they said, oh no, it's too dangerous. There are snipers there. I was in southeast Turkey a couple of years ago and I said, well, I want to go and see where this one human rights activist was assassinated. So they took me through, in the middle of Diyarbakir, they took me through this neighborhood. There was an armed guards out front. You get back, and all of a sudden you see utter destruction. Not a building was standing. And I said, wow, it was absolutely amazing. They just flattened whole parts of the city to kill a few dozen terrorists. There are more journalists in the world, most journalists in the world in prison right now in Turkey, more than in other places, more than in China, which is quite striking. Many opposition politicians are in prison. The independence of the judiciary has been literally destroyed, and then the changes have been enshrined in the Constitution, which was adopted or after you had a referendum in which you had significant electoral fraud and no freedom of the media. So Turkey is an ongoing human rights crisis. Hungary. I just wrote an article which will come out very soon in the European Yearbook of Human Rights documenting the crises in Hungary and Poland, where you basically had a systematic dismantling of the independence of the judiciary over the last few years. Government-run propaganda campaigns against migrants and everything linked to George Soros. Restrictions on NGOs, sometimes echoing Russian practice, and the public service broadcaster, which has become a government propaganda outlet. Finally, Poland. Same thing with the judiciary. It's an ongoing battle there. In Hungary, it's done. In Poland, the struggle continues. Many judges are fighting back. The European Commission, and especially the Court of Justice of the European Union, finally got engaged. The public service broadcaster, though, is gone. It's a government propaganda outlet. One interesting aspect about how the Poles destroyed the independence of the judiciary is they used the Hungarian method of brainwashing the population beforehand. So if in Hungary you had government-run propaganda campaigns against migrants and Soros, in Poland you had a government-run campaign against the judiciary. So you had posters all over Poland saying how corrupt and dysfunctional the judiciary was. And this paved the way for the Polish authorities to say, we have to reform this broken system because clearly it doesn't work. So you had one branch of government carrying out a campaign against another branch of government. Here, women were on the front lines, so you had a number of efforts to target women's rights in Poland. You might remember you had women's marches where women would wear black and go out on the street, thousands and thousands of women, to protest proposed restrictions on sexual and reproductive health and rights. Right after that march, all the major women's organizations were raided by the tax authorities. Huge pressures on women's NGOs. They're very much on the front line of this. But on top of that, we have a crisis in the organizations. I can say that you could probably add a number of other countries to this list of 5, but those were the 5 that I had to deal with most during my mandate. Crisis in the organizations. You have many countries which are openly challenging the court and saying, you have no right to rule on these kinds of issues. You have long delays in implementation. Russia, Ukraine, and Moldova are the leaders here, and delay of implementation of judgments. You have selective implementation. Sometimes they say, oh, this judgment is political. It is not possible to implement it. Non-cooperation with a number of the mechanisms. During my mandate, Russia was the only country that didn't cooperate with me after I went to Crimea. But you have a number of countries that don't let in rapporteurs that say, oh, the Venice Commission, this constitutional experts, oh, they're biased political. They've come here doing political tourism. So you have, this is a trend. The budgetary crisis, okay, Russia paid back the money it owed, but the crisis, I think, is not over because the member states don't want to give money, enough money to keep up with inflation. So every year the budget in reality gets smaller. You had a corruption scandal in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe linked to Azerbaijan and its lobbying, and it hasn't really recovered. And you had the whole controversy about letting the Russian delegation come back after not having fulfilled any of the conditions that the Parliamentary Assembly made for it. Such that last week, I just got back from Strasbourg yesterday, you had a number of delegations boycotting the plenaries. So this issue continues to divide the Council of Europe and especially the Parliamentary Assembly. The OSCE. The OSCE has some of the most dysfunctional internal procedures of any international organization that I know. One country can block the budget. One country can block the appointment of somebody for a high-level post. If you didn't follow it, about 2 years ago, they had to choose the top people running the OSCE, the director of the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw, the representative on freedom of the media, the High Commissioner on National Minority Rights, and the General Secretary. Well, what did they do? They couldn't agree on individual candidates, so they made it a package deal. So imagine if the Council of Europe were to choose the Commissioner, the Secretary General, the President of the Assembly, and the President of the Congress of Local and Regional as a package deal. This is not where human rights wins. This is where politics trumps human rights. The Human Dimension Implementation meetings, if you've ever been to one in Warsaw, they've become forums for gongos sent from all countries. It's quite depressing. The OSCE presence in many countries has not been welcome. They were kicked out of Azerbaijan, not allowed into Turkey, and in Ukraine, monitors have been targeted by different sides in the conflict. The EU, I already mentioned about the threats to Schengen, but the Eurozone is under threat. We'll see what happens with Italy. It survived the last round. We'll see if it survives this government. Enlargement is stalled. We have Brexit. We have a fragmented Eurosceptic European Parliament. And the interesting kind of political science question is, can the EU survive if it has non-democratic member states? The Council of Europe has survived 70 years with some not very democratic member states. But the EU is based on daily cooperation, trust in each other's judiciaries, And I think it's quite problematic if the EU, if these authoritarian regimes in Poland and Hungary consolidate, because it can put the whole project into question. What are the solutions to these crises? Well, one is that the organizations should return to their core business. They shouldn't try to do everything. They should just try to do the key things. What those are, nobody can tell you, but that's often what you hear. That we should be focusing more on social and economic rights. Everybody understands this. We should address inequality, which has fed into this populist wave. We should communicate better. Our reports are boring. Nobody reads them. We have to learn how to use Twitter, how to use Facebook, how to use films, Instagram, and then the problem will be solved. We have to reach out to new audiences. We only talk to ourselves, to the usual suspects, the liberal urban elites. We have to foster new forms of participation, local referenda, citizens' assemblies, because one thing that the populist wave shows is that many people want to participate. So how do we channel that desire for participation into a constructive way, into a constructive direction? Will it work? I'm a bit skeptical. The whole system of human rights in Europe and globally was created on the ashes of World War II. Why was it created? Basically because people wanted to prevent war, genocide, and dictatorship. Well, you go around Europe, you talk to the populists, you talk to others, and people aren't afraid of war, genocide, and dictatorship. They're afraid of terrorists, they're afraid of migration, they're afraid of economic uncertainty. So if we can't retell the story of human rights and change the narrative so that it's relevant to these concerns, we will lose. So we have to retell the story of human rights. And that's not an easy task. The populists are probably here to stay. There's a great book by Roger Eatwell and Matthew Goodwin about national populism that traces the long-term trends that led to their rise in Europe. The basic conclusion is that they're not going anywhere. These aren't flashes in the pan that will come up and disappear. Again, they're here to stay. I am worried about the long-term impact of the economic crisis because what was a very common pathology of the economic crisis: child poverty, child hunger, evictions, health problems, and youth unemployment. Now, those things will have a long-term impact on this generation that experienced them. That will not be taken care of in a year or two. That will affect many of these kids for the rest of their lives. And the media situation is getting worse and worse because social media has created echo chambers, polarization, radicalization, and given all kinds of new tools to repressive governments to go after the opposition and civil society. Is a crisis fatal? I would submit probably not, but it's quite serious. To me, there are a number of key questions that arise. One is, will other countries step up to compensate the money and political clout of countries that are skeptical or moving away from human rights? For example, one positive example was, what did Trump do in the US? He cut funding for family planning, basically to give people advice about contraception and abortion all over the world. A number of European countries stepped up, led by the Netherlands, and said, okay, we're going to create a new fund to fund these kinds of projects worldwide. Will this happen in other areas? Will other countries step up when the traditional supporters of human rights back down? Can this weakened system cope with new challenges? What are the new climate change is going to be a huge issue, which intersects with human rights: right to health, right to life, right to private life, access to information. Will it be able to deal with the challenges posed by artificial intelligence, in which many of the biases that are present and prejudices across Europe are being built into systems that take decisions for us? And finally, do young people care? Do young people care about human rights? Are they worried about war? Do they care about Europe? If I were a young person affected by crisis, by the economic crisis, played the game, got a good education, and can't get a job, why should I care about Europe? I need a job. I need that promise of some kind of stability and progress that my parents had. For young people, I think to convince them to to care about human rights and to care about Europe is a huge challenge, and we're not doing a good job at it at all. I will stop there and take your questions or comments.